The Boys Season 1. Let's talk about it. So I'm aware there are several shows out now that are attempting to satirize or critique the superhero genre. I haven't seen Doom Patrol or The Umbrella Academy yet, though I have seen Amazon Prime's The Boys and HBO's Watchmen. While I found Watchmen had great production, music, and some really strong acting, its pacing was a little awkward. Its story arcs were all over the place, and its social commentary was somewhat heavy-handed. I thought The Boys handled the idea of superheroes in the real world much more effectively. It has a good amount of dark humor in it, while HBO's Watchmen is somber in tone and mostly humorless. The Boys is extremely critical of hero worship and celebrity culture. Early on, the protagonist Chewie tears down his superhero posters after seeing Supes up close, as they really are, and becoming disillusioned with them. This is very relevant, as we live in a superhero and celebrity-obsessed society. I grew up as a big fan of Marvel and DC, and even I'm really tired of superhero movies. Celebrity actors pretend to be heroes. They spend their lives crafting their bodies to appear on screen as a form of unattainable physical perfection. The heroes in The Boys are also not really heroes, but actors playing heroes. People with superpowers are traded like free agents in sports, and they give speeches like politicians, but they're not heroes. They're not formally trained like the military. They're just people that have been given a drug by a corporation, and in turn have developed immense psychological issues. Huge corporations push celebrity heroes on the public eats it up, and in turn give corporations more money. It's funny to me that The Boys, a story where the evil corporation Vought is a main villain, is funded by Amazon. One of the other main underlying themes of both the comic and the show is the fear and danger of a privatized military, as the company Vought becomes more powerful, trying to manipulate its way into the Department of Defense. I've seen The Boys called everything from a nothing burger to woke garbage to a show made by and for psychopaths. I think those who would call it a nothing burger didn't get it at all. Those who would call it woke garbage might have missed the point, because it actually pokes fun at the idea of wokeness. And those that called it a show for psychopaths might need to clutch their pearls a little less tightly. I went back and read all 72 issues of the comic book created by Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson. I also read the 6-part miniseries Herogasm. Yes, I did just say Herogasm, which takes place between issues 30 and 31, as well as Highland Laddie, taking place between issues 47 and 48, and Butcher Baker Candlestick Maker, taking place between issues 59 and 60. The first episode, The Name of the Game, which is the name of the first comic book story arc, sets everything up wonderfully. The two major events here are the catalysts for the entire story, and involve our main characters, Jack Quaid's Huey Campbell, and Erin Moriarty's Annie January, aka Starlight. I've never seen many of these actors, with the exception of Carl Urban, who is always good. I do think this show is generally well cast. Fun fact, Jack Quaid is the son of Dennis Quaid. Huey and Annie are pretty much the only characters in the show who do not start off morally compromised. Nearly every character kills without remorse and has heavy psychological issues. And I'm including the boys themselves, though they technically are the heroes. The first major event occurs a few minutes in when A-Train, a parody of The Flash, smashes through Huey's girlfriend Robin, exploding her into pieces. This is quickly swept under the rug, and A-Train's life and outlook remain completely unaffected. Meanwhile, Starlight fulfills her lifelong dream of joining the top 7 heroes, only to be sexually assaulted on her first day at the job. Each of these characters become disillusioned, which then causes the audience to call into question the whole superhero genre. In reality, The idea of people with superpowers is a lot more frightening than it is fun. The comic book sometimes goes out of its way to be as politically incorrect as possible. It is a work of satire, though. These characters are both representations of reality and distortions of it. The boys can be sometimes humorous and sometimes critical, but it will almost certainly offend somebody. There are definitely a lot of storylines from the comic that would not play well at all with a mainstream audience. So the beats of the show are pretty different after the first few episodes. The first 4 episodes set up the 5 members of the boys. Huey is Scottish in the comic, and he's a little more schlubby there. He looks a bit older and is bald with a goatee. Simon Pegg, who plays Huey's dad, was an inspiration for the original comic book character. I suppose they changed him to appease American audiences, and though I do love his Scottish character from the comic, I still like what they did with him in the show. He's still a classic protagonist, a lovable loser character who's really uncomfortable with the idea of killing. But now he's grappling with that because he's basically been recruited in a war against superheroes. When Huey says who his top 3 musicians are, I think that really says a lot about his character.
Do you know who my favorite musician is? Who? James Taylor. Number 2, Simon and Garfunkel. Number 3, Billy Joel. Any of those guys, they don't infiltrate.
Billy Butcher is the leader of the group, but he's also the loose cannon.
Holy fuck! That was diabolical!
He's a man's man, a take no prisoners, dirty Harry type vigilante. And he is presented with an awareness of the issues inherent in this representation of masculinity. Though we as an audience sympathize with him through his motivation against Supes, as it was the man who is most emblematic of them, Homelander, who raped his wife. Butcher is reckless and incredibly prejudiced against anyone with superpowers. And because we know early on that Huey is falling for a girl with superpowers, we know this is going to be a major point of contention later on. In the comics, he's clean shaven, and in the show he's more rugged, but I think Carl Urban does a fantastic job with the curse-laden dialogue and the overall complexity of the character. Laz Alonso as Mother's Milk is one of my personal favorite characters.
That's a nickname?
No, my mother actually named me Mother's Milk.
Did she?
MM is the glue that holds the group together. Butcher is technically the leader, though he is so off the rails, and MM is often the voice of reason. I will have to spoil something from the comic in order to talk about his name. His mother worked in a factory with poor health standards. She and her son were both born with compound V in their bodies. As a result, MM does possess super strength, though even as an adult, he has to drink his mother's breast milk out of a flask he carries around, or he will wither up and start to die. This means that he will only live as long as his mother continues to live. In the comics, all of the other boys have injected Compound V from the start in order to fight against various superhero teams. The show has narrowed the focus in on the 7, who the boys didn't directly go up against in the comics until near the end. The Frenchman, played by Tomer Capon, and the female, played by Karen Fukuhara, are the group's muscle. They're both killing machines, and the female's rage is only reined in by the Frenchman's compassion. In the show, she has been given the name Kimiko, most likely because the creators were worried about coming across misogynistic. She is in a group called The Boys, so having the female be her codename honestly didn't seem that offensive to me. They still refer to him as Frenchie. Are French people offended by that? There is some humor about French stereotypes in his backstory, actually. The actor that plays him isn't really French, he's Israeli, and I've seen some criticism of his French accent. It didn't take me out of the show, but I often couldn't understand what he was saying. Regardless, I think the core group of the boys are all great in the show. It's what makes the boys, so you do have to get that right. The second episode, Cherry, is also the second story arc in the comic, which focuses on Starlight's sexual assault, as the boys go up against a smaller superhero team called the Teenage Kicks. The third episode, Get Some, is the name of the third arc in the comics, although none of this story arc is used for the show. It's just way too offensive. even for a streaming show. This is where the show begins to deviate from the comics and do its own thing, which I'm totally okay with. After reading the comic, I don't think the show needs to be a complete recreation of it. The major issue of Starlight's sexual assault is handled differently in the show. In the comic, she is forced to perform oral sex on Homelander, Black Noir, and A-Train to join the team, not the Deep. The Deep is a very minor background character in the comic, where he's just kind of a joke because he's a guy in a diving suit. I feel like they don't know where to go with him in the show, because after he gets canceled, it's all just jokes about how, isn't it lame to have a superpower where you talk to fish? And isn't this guy a total douche? I mean, granted, the idea that he has carnal relations with a dolphin is pretty funny. The comic book actually has some jokes about bestiality in it, and I was surprised to see they went there. Seeing that same dolphin propelled into the air was laugh out loud hilarious just because it was so wrong. But then there's the scene with the lobster too, and the scene where the girl tries to finger bang his gills. I don't know, this just all feels like stuff Seth Rogen might have come up with while high. I have no idea if this is true or not. It's pure unfounded speculation. The whole redemption arc parody they're doing with the Deep is not my favorite part of the show, but I don't entirely hate it. The comic began in 2006 and concluded in 2012, so the storyline about sexual assault in the workplace was not shoehorned in for the sake of a Me Too storyline, and it's toned down from the comic where it wasn't just one lowly positioned member of the team, but several of the team's major players who were all complicit. As a reader, this is when you first realize the Superman character Homelander is going to be one of the main antagonists. In the show, it's not until the end of episode 1 when he shoots down a plane because he thinks it will satisfy Madeline Stillwell. By the way, Elizabeth Shue is great in the role. In a way, Homelander is trying to protect her. In the comic book, he also shot down a plane, but his reasons for doing it cannot even fully be understood until near the end of the comic's run, so I won't ruin it here. The highest ranking character from Vought the audience sees in the comic book is James Stillwell, although in the show, Giancarlo Esposito's CEO Stan Edgar seems to be portrayed more like James Stillwell. In the comic, Stan Edgar is never seen and only talked about or quoted in transcripts of conversations, giving a sense of mystery to his character. Homelander often lashes out at James Stillwell as though Stillwell is his father, and Stillwell is unintimidated. Homelander's parent-child relationship with a Vought employee is similar in the show to his mommy fetish with Madeline. At first we think Homelander, narcissist that he is standing in the hall staring at a picture of himself, though he is actually watching Madeline pump breast milk. You can't talk about the boys without talking about breast milk. Maybe I should have been saying titty milk. Colby Minifie plays Amy Barrett, and there is a character later into the comic, Jess Bradley, that is a protege of James Stillwell. They're not really the same character, but they do fill a similar role. Amy Barrett is the PR person in charge of handling the group's image, and her character is the embodiment of the fake woke corporate agenda pusher.
16 points with females 18 to 49, even in the liberal retreat jurisdictions like New York and San Francisco.
Vought, like any other corporation's main concern, is the bottom line, and all of its posturing and planning is about image and nothing deeper. Antony Starr's Homelander, the narcissistic psychopath who has to wrap himself in the American flag in order to be loved, is one of the most interesting parts of the show.
I'm the world's greatest superhero.
The relationship between Homelander and Madeline, and his addiction to and rebellion of subjugation by her, casts Homelander as an untamed, childlike character. Antony Starr uses these subtle facial expressions that make it feel like Homelander is always right on the verge of completely losing it. I'd never seen this actor before in anything, and I'm really impressed by his work here. Homelander and Butcher, the two opposing group leaders, are great mirror characters, as either will do whatever it takes to succeed, no matter what the cost. This is obvious if you take a look at this image from the comic book. Butcher reveals his dark side most when he goes after Starlight with a Serbu BFG 50A that uses 50 caliber bullets, which would be used to pierce an armored vehicle. I think this gun suits Butcher's character as he's a pretty dangerous vigilante. It even has BFG in the name. If you're not in the know about the BFG, then I would suggest giving Doom a try. You can play Doom on literally anything. The flow of the comic cuts between Huey and the boys, taking out superhero teams one by one, back to Starlight and her interactions with the Seven. In the early parts of the comic, the boys are running surveillance on the teenage Kicks, who steal drugs and partake in orgies. They have, among others, one image of a member Popclaw cutting herself, which is bad for PR, so the boys blackmail them to sow division in the group. This was simplified in the show into the Popclaw A-Train romance storyline, where the boys spy on her to obtain samples of Compound V. Huey and Starlight do not know that they are on opposing sides for much longer in the comic book. It allows a lot of tension to build, as the reader knows that they are keeping secrets from one another, and when everything comes out, it's emotionally devastating. The show rushed this, and I'm curious to see where the love plot goes, because it really is the heart of the story. All of the political satire and social commentary wouldn't work if we didn't have something as simple as a love story to ground it all. Without Huey and Annie, The Boys doesn't really work, as the viewer is asked to call into question the institutions of government, religion, and the media, and the influence corporations have on our lives. The quiet moments between Huey and Annie provide something pure that we can grasp onto, when everything else is falling apart before our eyes. The makeup of the Seven is similar in the comic, with Homelander, Black Noir, and Queen Maeve being the most powerful three. An obvious parallel of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. A-Train is the Flash, the Deep is Aquaman, and Jack from Jupiter is the Martian Manhunter. Jack from Jupiter and the Deep are kind of joke characters. Lamplighter is dead in the comic, though he is brought back as a zombie. Starlight is his replacement, and the final member. Jack from Jupiter is probably the group's weakest link. He can turn invulnerable if he uses a magic word, so the invulnerable skin makes him a little like the TV show's Translucent.
Translucent doesn't even mean invisible. It means semi-transparent.
Translucent can turn invisible, and he uses this to spy on people, though it's inherently creepy because he has to be naked to do it, so of course he's just jerking off all the time. In the first season, Translucent is blown up by Huey with an anus bomb, though in the comics, Huey's first kill is when he accidentally punches through a character named Blarney Cock, who after dying has a hamster crawl out of his ass. Huey adopts the hamster, though later, Blarney Cock is brought back to life by Vought, and in a zombified state, shows up to get his hamster back. Honestly, I like both. One is the Invisible Man plus an anus bomb, and the other is a zombie who has come back to find his butt hamster. Huey names the butt hamster Jamie. Episode 5, Good for the Soul, comes from the story arc Believe that occurs much later in the comics, so there's sort of a leap here. In the comic, Starlight does not come out and say a bunch of controversial things about Christianity, which in the show I thought was ironically a little preachy. I just think the way that the comic handled this from a more satirical approach was more effective. In the comic, she follows her script for the event, although she has pretty much lost her faith after belonging to the Seven for so long. We do get a scene not from the comic where Homelander aggressively baptizes Huey, which is pretty funny. There's another funny scene with this character Ezekiel. So there is a character in the comic, Oh Father, who sexually abuses his sidekicks. This is handled with a lot more humor in the show, and I think it's a good example of why I like the show's writing so much.
You played my butt like jazz, with poise and skill and willingness to improvise.
In the comic, this is where Huey learns about what Annie had to do to join the Seven, and he becomes angry and judgmental. He lashes out, and though he comes across like a jerk, it all feels very real. He also has even more reason to specifically hate A-Train in the comic. A-Train's killing of Robin was accidental, because he was high on Compound V, and he hasn't sexually assaulted Starlight like he does in the comic, so he's not quite as detestable as his original portrayal. So far. His storyline here centers around his addiction to Compound V, and how it alienates him from other people in his life. His powers and overall health seem to be deteriorating due to his addiction, so he's treated with a little more nuance than in the comics. He's also played for laughs too, like in the Make-A-Wish scene, where this kid's wish is to see translucent, but as they're trying to cover up his disappearance and death, they send A-Train instead.
You'll teach me to outrun cancer?
This scene is also unique to the show. Queen Maeve in the comic is portrayed as much more cynical than in the show. I can't remember any panels where she doesn't have a martini in her hand. In the show, she has a secret relationship with a woman named Elena, while in the comic, she has many lovers. The event that scars her permanently is basically the same. The Seven show up to stop the events of 9/11 and fail, and unlike Homelander and the others, Maeve forever carries the guilt upon her. In the comic, the plane hits the Brooklyn Bridge instead of the Twin Towers, and Homelander actually tries to stop the plane, but breaks it in half, where in the show he just completely gives up and walks away. In the show, they toned it down by changing it from 9/11 to a fictional plane crash. Black Noir isn't explained until the end of the comic, and that is a major spoiler, so I won't ruin anything. But for most of the comic book, he's in the background. There are some interesting moments in the show that hint he has more personality than that of a simple killing machine, like when he sits down at the piano and begins to play Chopin's 1-minute waltz quite elegantly. It's possible they will change more about Black Noir as the show continues. They have already begun this process by excluding him from the Starlight storyline. There are a few minor characters I'd like to mention as well. Jonah Vogelbaum is the scientist who created Homelander. He's an important part of the world building in the comic, though he's mostly in the background. In the show, he's played by this guy, John Doman.
You're my greatest failure.
I see him everywhere. He played major roles in The Wire. He played the corrupt Pope Rodrigo Borgia in the show Borgia. Not the show Borgias, where Jeremy Irons played the same character. He played Carmine Falcone in Gotham. He had small roles in Person of Interest and Oz. I always like to see this actor. Haley Joel Osment plays a shady character named Mesmer who can read people's minds. I completely forgot about this subplot until I rewatched season 1, and it's one of the weaker elements of the season. There is a little humor in seeing a washed up actor play a washed up superhero. Sorry, Hey Joe. Do people call him that? The biggest spoiler for season 1 would be the cliffhanger ending, where it turns out that Butcher's wife was not killed, and this is a major departure from the comics. In the comic, Becca Butcher and her child died during childbirth, and Butcher's only drive is to get revenge. Now that they are alive in the show, this sets up future events to play out very differently. I think I'm gonna leave it at that.
You could take the blue pill. Or was it the red pill? Anyway, take the other pill and quit being a cunt.
Which pill do you want me to take?
Just quit being a cunt.